Well, Bungie was back this week with another Lightfall blog post, and this time going into detail related to the weapons sandbox and balancing coming down the pipeline. It's mainly focused on heavy weapons, plus we got some of the subclass verbs being added to exotic weapons. Well, Destiny fans are always interested in sandbox tune before a big raid, and that is coming out in only a few weeks' time. Well, if you're new around here or found this useful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below for all the latest Destiny 2 content, and turn on notifications by hitting that bell, and roughly 95% of viewers who watch This Week in Video Games aren't subscribed. So subscribe today and never miss an update. Okay, without further delay, let's dive right into that update from Bungie. So they say about weapon archetypes. When playing on console, your reticle will turn red when it's over an enemy that's inside your weapon's effective range. It's a useful visual aid. We wanted to be global for a while, so we've enabled this on PC as well. In a future season, we're going to be making the colour of this customizable, similar to the base reticle colour. Okay, first of all, linear fusion rifles then, so you probably saw this coming. Linear fusion rifles outperform other heavy weapons for boss damage by a wide margin. They've had plenty of time in the sun. We're bringing them down enough for other options to compete, and at the same time, exotic heavy linear fusion rifles don't do enough to justify using one over a legendary, so they are not affected by this nerf. So reduced damage versus champions, mini-bosses, bosses and vehicles by 15%, and Sleeper Simulant and Queen Breaker are ineffective. Sleeper fans, this is not a drill. Next up, machine guns. So machine guns have been buffed a few times over the past year or so, but only in PvE. We opted to increase their base damage a little, which makes them more forgiving to use in PvP. The buff also applies this across the board in PvE, so PvP damage is typically the base, and PvE has multipliers on top of that. And we are also substantially increased machine gun reserves, giving them a higher uptime, particularly useful in hard content. So increase the damage by about 10% with the following effects on time to kill against Guardians with a tier 6 resilience. So high impact frame, TTK reduced from 0.67 seconds to 0.5 seconds. Rapid fire frame, TTK reduced from 0.53 to 0.47. And adaptive frame, TTK unchanged at 0.53. And increase the reserve ammo by 50% at 0 inventory stat and 20% at the 100 inventory stat. Next up, heavy grenade launchers. So heavy grenade launchers haven't been touched in a while and are substantially below other heavy options for damage. On top of that, grenade launcher projectiles have a travel time, a ballistic arc, and a relatively small blast radius, so it can be hard to consistently land shots on a moving target, and they may hit fewer targets with explosion than you would expect. With this change, heavy grenade launchers should be significantly more useful in PvE and easier to use in both PvE and PvP. So increased damage versus champions, mini-bosses and bosses and vehicles by 20% and miners by 40%, that is huge. Improved projectile collision, making it slightly easier to land hits. And increase the blast radius by 1 meter. And Parasite is unaffected, it does huge damage already. Next up, shotguns. So the new shotgun reticles show the correct spread pattern, but in its shipping form the size of the reticle wasn't affected by the current spread angle, which will change if you jump with a magazine option like smoothbore. This change should make the reticle accurate in most ways at an 85-degree field of view. And change for this accurate across all field of view options will come in a future season. So shotgun reticle now changes in side proportional to the spread angle. And a related note, the Legend of Accuracy hip fire reticle is now a little bit more representative of its very large spread angle. Well, next up we have kinetic weapons. So kinetic slot weapons have always done 5% more damage versus unshielded targets in PvE. This meant that the kinetic slot stasis weapons were straight up better, with extra functionality and no downside. Wanted to give players more of a reason to run kinetic damage type weapons, so instead of a blanket kinetic slot damage boost, we're switching to a kinetic damage type boost based on whether your kinetic weapon uses primary or special ammo, and increase the bonus significantly. So kinetic primary weapon damage multiplier increased from 1.0.5 to 1.1, and kinetic special weapon damage multiplier increased from 1.0.5 to 1.15, and kinetic slot weapons no longer have that 5% damage bonus versus unshielded targets in PvE. There's also a kinetic damage type perk coming in Lightfall. Okay, next up, exotics. So just like many players, we've wanted exotic weapons to have a strong theming around their damage, to use the real subclass 3.0 verbs And Lightfall's longer development and playtest cycle gave us this opportunity to add subclass verbs to many of the top picks. So our goal with adding subclass 3.0 verbs is to grant these weapons additional functionality and let them tie into the subclass builds in a more meaningful way. In most cases, this is also all paired with a hefty buff. So, the Queen Breaker's blinding effects was underwhelming for heavy weapons, so we changed how that is deployed. So note that the Queen Breaker was also not affected by the global damage reduction to linear fusion rifles, making it substantially stronger by comparison. Shot now changed nearby enemies using Arc 3.0 blind. So that is a really nice change. Next up, Ruinous Effigy feels very voidy, and slamming the Transmutation Sphere was an obvious place to put an additional effect. So the Transmutation Sphere slam attack now suppresses. The Leviathan's Breath buff from a few seasons back inadvertently reduced the PvP damage enough. They can no longer one-hit kill players in their super with a headshot. So we fixed that, but also added Volatile and increased damage versus champions substantially to highlight its anti-champion role. So now applies Volatile on a perfect draw impact. Increase the damage from 396 to 442. It allows it to once again one-hit kill all supers in PvP. And increase the damage versus champions by 30%. 1000 Voices was briefly a top pick in Season 14, but it's been eclipsed by other options since then. We wanted to lean even more into the chain of solar explosions by adding Scorch, with the global heavy weapon changes also a strong option. So if you've got Ember of Ashes equipped, landing a full burst on a single target will trigger an ignition immediately, and the exact results may vary depending on whether other players are also scorching a target. So each explosion now applies 10 plus 5 with Ember of Ashes Scorch stacks. That is really, really exciting stuff. Sunshot was a top candidate for applying solar subclass verbs, and explosions are the clear place to do so. Explosions on a kill now applies 10 plus 5 Scorch stacks. That is very, very exciting, and Sunshot was always the obvious one when it came to adding solar verbs, so really, really good stuff. Next up, Polaris Lance always had a burn effect, so it was the obvious change to switch this to Scorch, so perfect fifth shots now apply 40 plus 20 Scorch stacks instead of a custom burn. Two-Tailed Fox has tough competition as a heavy exotic weapon, but now it's the only weapon that can apply subclass verbs from multiple damage types without extra steps. The Solar Rocket now applies 60 plus 30 Scorch stacks instead of burn. The Void Rocket also applies suppress, and the Catalyst is going to complete that trifecta. That's really, really curious, so maybe that is going to add some arc effects, and hopefully it's going to add a third rocket. Next up with Prometheus Lens, so that has utility with its Solar 3.0 rework, but we wanted to give it something more spectacular on kills in addition. So added the incandescent perk to the Catalyst, that's really good. Grand Overture's latest buff increased the missile damage by 50%, brought it up plenty. It just needed its blind updated to tie into Arc 3.0, so switch the Catalyst to use Arc Blind. Well, next up then, we've got the perks, so with Strand coming to the game, along with a new Strand weapon damage perk, we've updated a couple of older perks. So Osmosis now works with Strand. Elemental Capacitor now has the following effect when using a Strand subclass, so plus 20 airborne effectiveness. Rewind rounds will be appearing on more weapons in Lightfall, but it was custom built to only work with the Volta Glass weapon set, so we tweaked it to be a little bit more general purpose, so rebuilt to work on non-Volta Glass weapons. Eager Edge had some bugs that needed addressing in a previous release. Now taking the time to do more of a complete rework, which also lets us reduce or remove most of the restrictions that were in place. So no longer deactivates when moving faster than 35 milliseconds, deactivates correctly after a single melee swing, reduce the base lunge distance from 2 to 1.8, reduce the airborne lunge distance penalty from 25% to 20%, and the enhanced perk now increases the lunge distance slightly back up to 2. Blinding grenades on grenade launchers don't do arc damage, so it's not appropriate for them to do Arc 3.0 blind effects. We didn't feel the need to change their disorientating effects though, so we've updated the name to overlap less, so renamed Blinding Grenades to Disorienting Grenades. Finally then, Vice Stinger, one of the most desirable origin traits in the game particularly, but not only on linear fusion rifles, to the point where it makes it hard for non-Vice weapons to compete. It needed some adjustment. With this change, it is still valuable, but more in line with other origin traits. So rip Vice Stinger, we really, really had fun while you were around. Okay, finally today, the future. So we are already hard at work on Seasons 21 and 22, and some of the changes we're making include adding a full auto melee accessibility setting, which will apply to all forms of melee, a pass over weapon type and exotic weapon hipfire reticles, including how visibly they change even at high FOV, adding features like charge meters and exotic perk counters. I've also got a balance change in the works, but it's a little too early to get into that. We've got more information to share post Lightfall. Well, thank you very much to Chris Proctor and the team for writing that. Is really, really good. And we have been spoilt recently with huge blog posts from Bungie. So that is really, really good. Loads of good stuff come up in Lightfall, and heavy weapons are going to be changing. So make sure you check through all of this information if you are getting ready for that raid. Well, let me know in the comments what you think about the changes. And that is it for now for all of the Season 20 sandbox previews. So let me know in the comments what you think. And as always, thank you so much for watching or listening. And for more Destiny 2 content like this, hit that subscribe button down below and subscribe to This Week in Video Games. Or you can check me out on Twitter at TWIVG Podcast. If you enjoyed this video, found it useful, liking and sharing the video would really help me out. Otherwise, check out the other videos on the channel. Thanks again, and I'll see you soon.